Hello again, it's Joseph, and welcome back to my Colonizing Kerbin series, episode 8 of Unlocking the Tech Tree. So this part right here is the primary thing in this episode that will focus on actually unlocking science points. I made this little truck thing to go to just a couple of biomes with the purpose of just getting a little bit more science points from some of the equipment that I've unlocked recently and haven't used on Kerbin. And that gave me just enough points to unlock one thing, and that was field science. So I had some remaining science points left over from last episode, and I just did that to try and see if I can unlock one more thing. But the majority of this episode is actually not going to be focused that much on obtaining science points. Instead, I'm going to be building 3 satellite networks. The first one, which we are launching right now, is making use of our first recoverable booster. So you'll see that in just a second, touching down safely upon the ocean of Kerbin. And then we got our fairings deployed. All right, here we go. So, burner engines on the side for maneuverability. We do a deceleration burn when we come back into the atmosphere. Deploy the parachutes as well as the air brakes, and then just a little puff of the engine right before we touch down. Want to make sure that we hit the water below 5 meters per second, otherwise we will have some of those engines destroyed. So this mission, as I said, we're going to be building 3 satellite networks. The first one is going to go into geostationary orbit. Here is the Resonant Orbit Calculator. I have a link down in the description. This is a great website to help whenever you're setting up satellite networks. I really love using it anytime I set up a satellite network. Basically, what I use that for is I plug in what the or the synchronous orbit height will be for my satellite network. There's a little button down you set to dive orbit, and that will give you the periapsis height. So in this case, to get a synchronous orbit in Kerbin, you need to have an orbit of 2,863,334 meters. And then what you do is you set the periapsis to 1,222,703 meters. So this craft has 3 satellites on it. I release a satellite. It does a circularization burn, and with a little fine tuning, we get the orbit perfectly synchronized, so that way it is always at that height and will be continuously at that height above its orbit of Kerbin. And then just come around 2 more times, releasing another satellite each time we get close to periapsis, and just repeat the process again. So basically that's what you're watching. Now, if you're not familiar with what a synchronous orbit means, essentially what that means is that each of these satellites will always be looking at the same angle of Kerbin at all times. What is neat about that is that that satellite will be relaying communications information to all parts of Kerbin from where it is at. And then, as you can see here on the map screen, I have 3 satellites, meaning that from equatorially, at least from 360 degrees, we have communication. Now, I wanted to do that at this stage because I just began last episode a mission to Moho. So we have Valentina and Bob heading to Moho, and I wanted to make sure that the probe cores on their vessels, on the command module and the lunar module, never lost contact with the KSC, because I do have satellite networks turned on, and if we lose that connection, we will be not able to make maneuver nodes, which could put me in a bind. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't run into that situation. So now you're watching me pretty much do the entire process all over again, and that is because I'm going to be building my second network around the Mun. Now, I have some science stations on the east side crater right now, and they should never be, since the Mun is tidally locked, they'll always be looking at Kerbin, but that doesn't mean that the KSC won't lose contact at some point, because it won't have a direct line of communication. So I decided to build a satellite network so that way If some science is triggered, it will always have a connection to the KSC, and we won't lose any science points. You should also notice that all the upper stages being used in these satellite networks in this episode, I'm having them make a collision course. The first two are going to collide with the Mun, and then when we get to our third satellite network at Minmus, it's going to collide with Minmus. And the nice thing is that I have seismic science stations there. And you may have noticed the text popping up whenever the upper stage collided with the surface of the Mun. So I am getting science points from having those collisions occur. Now for the Mun, you cannot do a synchronous orbit. In other words, you cannot set the satellites to where they're always looking at a singular point on the Mun, because they would have to go to an orbit way too high, and they would leave the gravitational influence of the Mun. So I decided to go for the highest orbit I can go with without getting outside this sphere of influence. And I usually go for about 2,160,000 kilometers. Specifically, I went for 2,160,101 meters. And then I just set the periapsis for my dive orbit to 1,042,087 meters. We now have our Kerbals from the last episode that went to Minmus, Jebediah, Bill, and Bersby are on their way to Duna. So I guess the three of them worked out whatever drama was going on last episode, and us at the KSC feel that it is okay for them to take this long journey together. If you want to find out what that drama was, go back to the previous episode and watch that. So it's going to take about 367 days in the game for them to get to Duna. So that means I should be able to complete the Moho mission before they get back, and I may do some additional things back home at the KSC before they come back. That upper stage that is getting the Duna craft to their destination, I will deorbit that when we get to Duna after it circularizes, and it will be destroyed there. So we should have plenty of Delta V for them to get back. So we basically just have one more network to set up, and that is going to be our Minmus relay network. Now at Minmus, you can establish a synchronous orbit because it spins fast enough that you don't have to go outside the sphere of influence to get a synchronous orbit. And that is at 357,941 meters above the surface of Minmus. And when we do the dive orbit, I'm going to set that to 159,956. Now all this is using the website that I was referring to, the Resonant Orbit Calculator. And again, that will be in the description. So if you would like to make use of that, I highly recommend it. And it looks like I'm going to have 3 successful touchdowns of the booster. Now you notice that the booster started to tip over there. I had to make sure to hit the recovery button as fast as possible because it can actually cause some of the parts to be destroyed when it tips over like that. So there's the Resonant Orbit Calculator for you. You can pause the video there and see all the information there. But again, I recommend you going and checking out that site for yourself and make use of that in your games. Well, that's pretty much going to wrap up the episode after we get done with this satellite network. And because of those impacts on the Mun and Minmus and those seismic impacts giving us science points, I was able to get enough science to unlock one more thing this episode. So I went on ahead and unlocked Advanced Metalworks. Well, anyway, that's the end of the episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time in episode 9.